be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus raised his eyes to heaven and said, Holy Father, I pray not only for these, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, so that they may all be one, as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be in us, that the world may believe that you sent me. And I have given them the glory you gave me, so that they may be one, as we are one. I in them, and you in me, that they may be brought to perfection as one, that the world may know that you sent me, and that you love them even as you loved me. Father, they are your gift to me. I wish that where I am, they also may be with me, that they may see my glory that you gave me, because you loved me before the foundation of the world. Righteous Father, the world also does not know you, but I know you, and they know that you sent me. I may know to them your name, and I will make it known, that the love with which you loved me may be in them, and I in them. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Today is the feast of St. Bernard, our parish patron, and today I am reminded of a conversation I had with some of my brother priests when I was just newly ordained, so about 5 years ago. I know some of you still feel like I'm newly ordained, right? But it was about 5 years ago, and I was in my first year of priesthood, and I was talking with some of my brother priests who had been ordained the same time as me, and we were kind of talking about how things have been going, and one of the priests, he asked, what's the most surprising thing about the priesthood? And I remember thinking that what I had said to the brother priest was that I was surprised at how prominent the spiritual realities become when you're ordained a priest. When I was in seminary, for example, we spent a lot of time studying the faith intellectually. We studied history, theology, and philosophy. But I didn't study the mystics. I didn't have a class on exorcisms or angels or miracles. But I was flabbergasted in my first few months as a priest, the stories that people would share with me. Oftentimes people experience miraculous occurrences or mystical experiences in their life, and they're kind of afraid to talk to people about it, lest they get mocked or criticized. But of course they tell their priest. They'll bring it up in confession or in spiritual direction. So, for example, right away, the first 6 months of my priesthood, I met 2 different people who had experienced Eucharistic miracles in their own personal lives. I had 2 different encounters with people who were in need of an exorcism. I met with various people who would tell me stories about their personal lives or their family lives, and it was very clear that there was some sort of diabolical force at work in them. And then, of course, I saw on the other end of the spectrum, I would see people who went from being completely passive Catholics to all of a sudden being like the most on-fire people in the parish. And it just switched like on a dime. The power of the Holy Spirit to change people's souls and hearts. I was struck by the spiritual realities that became so prominent as soon as I became a priest. And it's not that they were non-existent before, it's that I wasn't aware of them. And I know it's probably the same for most of you. These things are all around us, and yet most of us are very unaware. And I'm reminded of that on this Feast of St. Bernard, because St. Bernard, as our parish patron, he's not just simply a model for us to emulate. He's not just simply a saint to be revered and honored and studied. He is literally the guardian and protector of our parish. Just as every human being is conceived and receives a guardian angel, so when every Catholic church is dedicated, it receives a guardian saint literally assigned that task from heaven. St. Bernard's task is to be the guardian and protector of our parish. And I think we would all do well to take that more seriously, to be praying for his intercession, for his protection, to be asking him to send his own charisms that made him such a marvelous saint in his life, that our parish might take on those charisms of St. Bernard. Many of us have favorite saints. We like to pray to our guardian angels, etc., etc. We should all be praying to St. Bernard, protector, patron. You know, I didn't know a lot about St. Bernard when I was assigned here to St. Bernard Parish. And I knew some things about him. I knew that St. Bernard, for example, he was known for his great Marian devotion. And some of you are aware that the Salve Regina, or the Hail Holy Queen, and St. Bernard added the last line of that prayer. O clement, O loving, O sweet Virgin Mary. He is the one who added that to that very traditional song and prayer. St. Bernard wrote the Memorare. How many of you know what the Memorare is? Right? Special prayer to Mary, right? St. Bernard wrote that in great devotion to Mary. St. Bernard, he wrote a very extensive commentary on the Song of Songs, right? Which is basically an Old Testament love poem. How many of you read the Song of Songs? Some of you? Wabash students, make sure you read the Song of Songs. Use it in dating, right? As asking girls out. There's some beautiful lines in there, right? Like your hair is like a flock of goats. Your neck is like the Tower of David. That's what the Song of Songs recounts in this ancient love poem, right? St. Bernard, he wrote an extensive commentary on the Song of Songs. St. Bernard is known for preaching the Crusades. He was one of the greatest advocates of the Second Crusade. And yet many people, sometimes they might dismiss St. Bernard for that, because many people have this backwards idea of what the Crusades actually were. Many people think the Crusades was like this offensive, aggressive war of the big, strong, bad Christians, right, against the little, helpless Muslim armies in the Holy Land. Right? It's the exact opposite. The Islamic armies were the dominant world force in the world up until the 1600s. The Christians were always the minority and the underdog, and were constantly at risk of losing Europe to Muslim aggression. And the reason why the Crusades eventually started is because some of the Christians living in the Holy Land, oftentimes when the Muslims were in control, they would live reasonably peaceably with the Christians. But unfortunately, there was a very aggressive and violent sect called the Seljuk Turks that took power. And they started enslaving Christians and murdering Christians. And so the Christians begged the world for help. And so the Pope encouraged Christians to go and defend those Christians in the Holy Land. And that was the real story of the Crusades. St. Bernard was a great preacher of the Crusades. So I knew some of these things about St. Bernard when I was assigned here to our parish. But as I've been here, I've grown to love who St. Bernard was. And I really love that he is our patron and our protector. Now, if there's anything about St. Bernard that really is an inspiration to me, is that St. Bernard was a man of magnanimity. Magnanimity. Magnanimity is one of those words that in the English language has basically fallen out of use. Most people have never even heard of the word magnanimity, or if they have heard of it, they have a complete misunderstanding of what it actually means. I think if you check any modern English dictionary, it'll say something like, a magnanimous person is somebody who is generous, kind. That is not what magnanimity means. Magnanimity comes from two Latin words, magna, meaning great, and anima, meaning soul. A magnanimous person is someone who has greatness of soul. A magnanimous person dreams big dreams, hopes great desires. A magnanimous person expects great things of himself and brings it out of others. A magnanimous person is undauntedly upright and never settles for mediocrity, never settles for surface level conversation or silly complaining or gossip. A magnanimous person always holds the great things in his vision and seeks to strive after them. Magnanimity. It's a great Christian virtue. And it's a virtue that many Christians are unaware of. And when I think about the life of St. Bernard, I think of magnanimity. There's some really amazing stories about the life of St. Bernard. For example, when he became a monk, his family, because in the Middle Ages, sometimes there were monasteries that they really weren't very rigorous in their pursuit of holiness. It kind of became like a plush living quarters to be a monk. Because in the Middle Ages, sometimes monasteries, they had the greatest food, the greatest education, the greatest resources. And so when St. Bernard felt called to the priesthood, his family encouraged him to go to one of the plush monasteries, the Benedictine monastery. St. Bernard refused. He wanted to do the real thing. And so he decided to join one of the most austere and rigorous monastic orders of his day, the Cistercian order. And of course, his family didn't appreciate this very much. After all, St. Bernard was a very talented and gifted man. If he became a monk, he likely would become an abbot of that monastery and would be able to provide great stability for his family. And so his family famously sent 30 of his relatives to go and prevent St. Bernard from going. And you know what ended up happening to those 30 relatives? St. Bernard convinced each one of them to join the order with him. St. Bernard refused to be controlled by the desires of others. He had a greater vision. It is said one day, and this is maybe one of the more legendary stories about the life of St. Bernard, but we should be careful to be too skeptical, because we do know for a fact that St. Bernard could perform miracles. But it's said that one day he was preaching in a cathedral, and he was known for his fiery preaching. And apparently in the cathedral there was somewhat of an infestation of bees. So people began to be very distracted during his homily. And so the story goes that St. Bernard excommunicated the bees. And the next day, of course, there were hundreds of dead bees on the floor of the cathedral. Another story I love about St. Bernard is that even when he was young, very early on in the monastery, he distinguished himself in his pursuit of holiness. And so the monastery, even though he was very young, they asked him to go and start a new monastery in a place called Clairvaux. That's where he gets his name, St. Bernard of Clairvaux. And when he arrived there, he discovered that not only was there no monastery there, no buildings, but the land was basically a swamp. Sometimes in the Middle Ages, wealthy landowners, they would want to give something to the church because they wanted to make themselves right with God, but they didn't want to give their prized possessions. Right? So they would give away the swamp, right? The thing that nobody wants. And St. Bernard immediately went to work, and in that swamp, he built the most thriving monastery of his age. Magnanimity. Refusing to see risks and challenges, and instead always seeing opportunities. Instead of seeing a swamp, seeing a potential shrine for God, a potential paradise on earth. St. Bernard was a man of magnanimity. And I believe that St. Bernard, as our patron, as our protector, wants our parish as well to be a parish of magnanimity. I don't want our parish to be like every other parish. I don't want our programs to be like every other programs. I want our parish to be the guiding light of our community, a guiding light within our diocese. In the midst of a culture where so many Catholic churches are dying and shrinking, I want St. Bernard to be a place where the church is thriving and growing. There's reasons why so many things we do at St. Bernard, they're different than other parishes. And you know that most parishes, they want to grow youth ministry. So what do? You go out and hire a youth minister. Not big enough. We established an internship here at St. Bernard to have 3 youth ministers. We aren't just going to build a parking lot. We're going to build one of the 7 wonders of Crawfordsville. We're not just going to have a parish picnic. We're going to have live music, a mechanical bull, right? Whatever else we can find. I want St. Bernard to be the biggest and brightest and most thriving parish around. We are to be a parish of magnanimity. And not only our parish, but every individual member of St. Bernard. You all know that in so many Catholic churches, 90% of the parishioners are just merely passive onlookers in the pews. 90% of Catholics are passive, mediocre Catholics. Maybe they come to Mass if they can have time. Maybe they volunteer for something every once in a while. I've told many of you the story about my sister. That my sister, about 4 years ago, she was one of those mediocre and passive Catholics. Don't worry, she won't be offended, right? She tells people the story all the time. But she was one of most Catholics. Comes to Mass when you can, and that's about the extent of your faith. And thanks be to God, one of our family members was a rather pushy family member, a devout evangelical Christian. As you know, many evangelical Christians are always trying to ask the Catholics, have you been saved? And my sister got tired of this because every time it happened, she didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to respond. And so for 1 year, as her New Year's resolution, she said, this year I'm going to become a real Catholic so that I will be prepared the next time that I'm asked those questions. And sure enough, 4 years later, she's like a Shiite Catholic, man. She is serious. But it was amazing how she did it. It was amazing for me to be able to watch her growth. She's a young mom who works full-time. She has 3 young daughters, all under the age of 8. She doesn't have very much time. But she did little things. She started taking 20 minutes every day to read a spiritual book. And sometimes it was when she was on the treadmill, or sometimes it was listening to an audiobook on the way to dropping her kids off at their various activities. She found little things that she could manage, and she committed to doing them every single day. And if you do something every single day, that's 365 times in a year. And then you do that for 4 years, you'll grow in your faith. And that's part of the reason why she is today. I know there are some parishioners here at St. Bernard who have experienced things just as this. People who commit to small things but are very faithful every day. Sometimes it's parishioners who commit to making a holy hour every Wednesday. Sometimes it's parishioners who begin to start coming to daily Mass, make that their commitment. I remember very early on in my time here at St. Bernard, I was very edified by a parishioner. I won't mention her name, or Roger and Sharon Johnson, her parents. I don't want to embarrass her, right? But she has 3 little kids, right? And very early on in my time at St. Bernard, I noticed that every single day, after dropping her kids off at school, she would go to the Blessed Sacrament Chapel for about 15 minutes every day, praying her devotional. That's magnanimity. Being committed to not being a passive and mediocre Catholic, but committing yourself to growing in your faith. And it doesn't mean you have to quit your job or anything like that. It means finding one thing and being faithful to it. I don't want any passive Catholics at St. Bernard. And I know none of you want passive Catholics at St. Bernard. Nobody wants to be a mediocre and lukewarm Catholic. We want to know God. We want to love our faith. We want to know why it is that we do what we do. We want to know the stories of the Bible. We want to be able to respond to people's questions that they have for us. But in order to get there, you have to start with magnanimity. You have to want it. You have to desire it. And St. Bernard was a man who desired great things of himself and of his monastic brothers. Great things of the church. And he wants it for us. May St. Bernard be a place where magnanimity is fostered and pursued and loved. That we might be like St. Bernard, magnanimous men and women